Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, a weekly show with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott. For our main topic today, we'll be talking about getting pilots to slow down in a variety of phases of flight and pre-flight. And I'm going to tell you a couple stories about pilots I've flown with who didn't slow down and talk about some of the kind of mistakes they made. And while I'm telling you these stories, think about times when maybe you've been rushing and the mistakes that you've made because you didn't slow down. By the way, if you have any interest in buying a new or used Cirrus SR20, SR22, or Vision Jet, or you'd like flight training in one, I talk with several listeners every week who call me for advice on next steps and sometimes to talk about the trade-offs between buying new versus used aircraft. So if you're thinking about a new aircraft, definitely call me first. Call me today at 650-967-2500 for a free consultation and possibly free demo flight. Last week in episode 131, we talked about my flight in an SR-22 from Miami to California, so if you missed it, you may want to check it out. And just a quick note, if you haven't already, please click the subscribe button on your phone. Not only will that alert you when new shows are available each week, but it will also boost our rankings, which makes it more likely that other people will find the show. This week in the news, EAA announces free admission for youth at AirVenture, and Mooney opens the doors again. And we have another heartwarming story about pilots helping others who are less fortunate. All this and more, and the news starts now. From kitplanes.com and a variety of other sources, EAA to give free admission to youth at AirVenture. EAA announced that young people age 18 and under will be admitted for free to AirVenture Oshkosh 2020 in an effort to introduce more youth to the possibility of a world of flight. Boeing is financially supporting the effort for the next 2 years to encourage more aviation-minded families and their children to attend the event that brings more than 10,000 aircraft from around the world to Oshkosh each year. Quote, EAA's mission is growing participation in aviation, and in 2019, after EAA reduced admission costs for students, we saw an increased number of families coming to AirVenture, said Jack Pelton, EAA's CEO and chairman of the board. Inspiring young people and giving them a first look at what's possible in aviation is only achievable if they can get in the gate. This effort will build on more than 60 years where AirVenture has earned a reputation as a wonderful family event. We're incredibly appreciative of Boeing's support, and like EAA, Boeing is committed to inspiring the next generation of aeronautical innovators. The free youth admission is available through AirVenture all week long. Along with Boeing's financial support, a small fee on AirVenture advanced purchase adult admissions and value-added opportunities such as the Aviator Club will support this free admission opportunity for young people. Longstanding youth activities and programs at AirVenture include such popular offerings as the hands-on Kid Venture display and program area, educational options at Aviation Gateway Park, and extraordinary events such as the Daily Air Show, and more than 1,500 forums, workshops, and seminars. From flyingmagazine.com at flyingmag.com, Mooney reopens the Kerrville factory. After what can hopefully be appreciated as an extended Thanksgiving break, workers at Mooney are back at the historic factory in Kerrville, Texas. While the future of the company is not yet completely secure, there's a lot more optimism than there was a few weeks ago when the company furloughed its staff. In an official statement, the company said it is finalizing negotiations with a group of investors who have, quote, shown a high level of interest in acquiring Mooney with the intent of reestablishing the company as a viable production and support company for the Mooney brand of aircraft. Mooney is not disclosing any other information about the negotiations until papers have been signed and would not say how many people are currently employed. Like employees of many legacy aircraft manufacturers, Mooney's staff is highly dedicated to the brand despite the cyclical nature of the industry. Since the company reopened and started delivering aircraft again in 2014 under Chinese ownership, fewer than a dozen airplanes have been delivered annually, except in 2018 when a total of 14 Ovation and Acclaim Ultras were shipped. The increasing trend for deliveries continued this year as 8 customers picked up airplanes from the factory in the first 3 quarters. While the planes are made mostly of metal, some composite parts have been incorporated in later years, including the cowl and fuselage for the Ultra models, which have a door on each side. Previous Mooney models were delivered with one door. The company also brings in revenue from parts manufacturing, not only produced for legacy Mooneys, but for other manufacturers. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were spent upgrading the environment and equipment of the factory in the past 5 years. From AOPA.org, a bipartisan bill would spur transportation careers. Bipartisan legislation intended to draw attention to careers in the transportation industry and to diversify the workforce was recently introduced in the House. The bill, authorized by the DOT, Department of Transportation, is to develop and publish a series of digital, print, and broadcast media public service announcements that highlight the need for more professional airline pilots, air traffic controllers, mechanics, railroad workers, truck drivers, and other transportation industry professionals as the world becomes increasingly more mobile. The bill is called H.R. 5118. It's known as Promoting Service and Transportation Act, and it's to boost awareness of thousands of aviation jobs that will need to be filled. One of the sponsors, Representative Rick Larson, Democrat of Washington State, said the aviation industry will need more than 800,000 pilots, 769,000 technicians, and nearly 20,000 air traffic controllers to meet demand for the next 10 years. When the bill was announced, bipartisan leaders said that to meet these goals and develop a more diverse workforce, transportation opportunities should be better promoted to all Americans. Boeing's annual pilot and technician outlook identifies air travel trends for the next 20 years and includes the need for 914,000 cabin crew members, in addition to the 1.57 million pilots and maintenance specialists, figures that are likely to rise as the current professional workforce approaches retirement age. And they go on to say that the median annual wage for airline pilots, co-pilots, and flight engineers was $140,000 in 2018, and commercial pilots earned an average of $82,000, according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. The campaign will highlight aviation and land-based transportation career opportunities with additional emphasis on increasing diversity. From FlyingMag.com, the world's first electric race plane unveiled at the Dubai Air Show. As air race teams ramp up design and innovation ahead of the inaugural Air Race E all-electric air race series that will start in 2020, Condor Aviation of North Yorkshire, England, unveiled their White Lightning race plane, the world's first air racing airplane powered by electricity. The announcement came as the team displayed their entry at the 2019 Dubai Air Show. Condor Aviation's entry into Air Race E series is a heavily modified Cassat race plane, that's C-A-S-S-U-T-T, with a powertrain configured to produce 150 kilowatts of continuous power. Condor has had to overcome numerous engineering challenges, such as adjusting the center of gravity for the change in motors and increased weight from the batteries, which will produce power for 5 minutes of high-intensity racing and around 10 minutes of reserve flying at reduced power. The Cassat racer was once a regular on the Formula One racing circuit in Europe throughout the 1980s and 90s. The world's first electric air race plane has counter-rotating set of two motors coupled together. One spins clockwise and the other counterclockwise, leading to increased efficiency, higher maximum speed, and improved handling capabilities. Airbus is the official founding partner of the Air Race E-Series and is providing teams, including Team Condor, with industry insight and research as they build and modify their electric racing airplanes. From planeandpilotmag.com, pilots report bogus landing fee charges based on ADS-B data. Interesting story here. Pilots are reporting that out of the blue they're getting bills for landing fees at airports they never landed at. The news has privacy proponents and aviation consumer groups very concerned. Utah pilot Wendy Lessig was on an East Coast flying tour, flying her Super Cub along the Long Island shoreline at 1,000 feet AGL when she gave the Bridgeport Tower a call to ask for transition through their Class D airspace. Approved, they said, and she continued flying along, enjoying the easy sightseeing we all enjoy. Then, with no warning, a few weeks later, a bill showed up in the mail for the flight for departing from Bridgeport, which is a $7 fee. Nobody likes landing fees, or in this case, takeoff fees, but $7 seemed reasonable. But there was only one problem. Lessig never landed or took off from the Bridgeport airport. Similar stories have been going around on online forums, and many of them involve questionable bills from one company, Vector Airport Systems, through its Vantage system. Vector provides a variety of airport services that aren't cost-effective or that are too specialized for a small airport authority like Bridgeport's Sikorsky Memorial Airport to do on its own. Santa Monica is a customer of Vector as well, and pilots flying in and out of SMO get their bills from Vector, and most pay them without looking twice. The article says, "We wondered how Vector knows to bill planes for landing and other airport fees, so we did a little digging, and we weren't surprised to see that the company is most likely using ADS-B data." So while Vector doesn't say it uses ADS-B, their mention of flight tracking radar and flight plan tracking data suggests that they might. We reached out to Vector for comment, no response yet, asking specifically in part if it tracks planes via ADS-B. On her flight, Lessig contacted Bridgeport Tower so they had her plane's N number, but it's unclear how that data would have been shared by the controllers with Vector Airport Systems. Raw primary data returns wouldn't have the N number, of a VFR aircraft unless it was an ADS-B target. Lessig's PA-18 Piper Cub does indeed have ADS-B, she told plane and pilot. And a pilot is rescued after his plane crashes and gets tangled up in power lines. This comes from a press release at scottcountymn.gov, that's Scott County, Minnesota. On November 23rd at approximately 3:57 p.m., Scott County Sheriff's Office 911 dispatch received a report of a single-engine plane that had collided with a power line, become entangled, and was suspended upside down in the 2500 block of the 150th Street West in Louisville Township, south of Shakopee, Minnesota. Initial investigation indicated that the plane, a single-engine Piper Cub, was traveling south, hit a cluster of power lines, and became suspended on a guide line upside down. Once the power line was de-energized, the pilot was rescued from the plane. The pilot did not sustain any injuries as a result of the accident. This incident could have been much worse, said Sheriff Luke Hennon. We're grateful the pilot was able to walk away without any injuries. Investigation of the crash was turned over to the FAA. And from apnews.com, an Alaska pilot is convicted of lying to investigators after a crash. Forrest Kirst, 62, of Fairbanks, was convicted of 2 counts of obstruction of proceedings, according to U.S. Attorney Brian Schroeder. The crash near Adigan Pass seriously injured Kirst and 3 tourists from New Brunswick, Canada. 1 passenger died 35 days later. Kirst will be sentenced February 20th. The maximum penalty is 5 years in prison and a $250,000 fine. He was the commercial pilot of a 4-seat single-engine Ryan Navion and was doing business as Kirst Aviation. According to prosecutors, Kirst was flying too low for the geography south of the Brooks Range when he circled over a moose in a pond. The airplane lacked power and altitude to clear Adigan Pass and crashed on the side of a mountain. The NTSB investigated, and the FAA administration revoked Kirst's airman certificate. Kirst appealed that revocation. Kirst told the NTSB and the FAA that his airplane was at a higher altitude than what was reflected by GPS instrumentation. He also testified that the airplane dropped about 1,500 feet just before the crash. Prosecutors said both statements were false. And from coastmountainnews.com, border jumper tossed bags out of plane before arrest at British Columbia Airport. A border hopper in a small aircraft was chased back into Canada by U.S. Border Patrol agents before being met by Langley RCMP, that's Royal Canadian Mounted Police, at the Langley Regional Airport. The U.S. Customs and Border Protection's Bellingham Air and Marine Branch detected an airplane entering American airspace and landing at Methow, that's M-E-T-H-O-W, Methow Valley State Airport in Winthrop, a tiny town of a few hundred people in Washington State, roughly southwest of Osoyoos. According to U.S. Customs, when agents approached the pilot to question him, he jumped into his airplane and flew away. Agents in airplanes and helicopters pursued the mystery pilot all the way back to the Canadian border. On the way, they observed him throw several bags out of the airplane and into the wilderness below. U.S. Customs received permission to keep chasing the suspect across the 49th parallel and into Canada, where they followed the plane to the Langley Regional Airport. The pilot was met on the ground by RCMP Federal Border Enforcement Team, the Emergency Response Team, and RCMP Air Services, which flies helicopters out of Langley, and the Langley RCMP. The man was arrested and his airplane seized. U.S. Customs helicopters remained in the sky during the arrest. The Methow Valley Airport is a single runway and taxiway with no control tower. Quote, "It's an unmanned and uncontrolled airport," said manager G. Paul Wolf, who manages a number of small airports in Washington. The airport sees its biggest use in the summer when it's a staging point for smoke jumpers fighting fires in the state, according to Wolf. And from AOPA.org, AOP announces 2020 flying locations. The Aircraft Owner and Pilots Association has announced its much-anticipated 2020 flying locations. 3 locations, which are 2-day events, will kick off May 29th and 30th in San Marcos, Texas at the KHYI Airport, and June 19th and 20th in Casper, Wyoming, and the final one will be September 11th and 12th in Rochester, New York at the KROC Airport. Now, these are always fun events. I've spoken at a number of them in the past. If there's any way you can make it to one of them, I'd encourage you to do that. And finally in the news, a rather heartwarming story about pilots helping others. This also comes from AOPA.org, and they say GA aids migrant farming communities in rural Mexico. The article talks about a trip to San Quintin, Mexico, which I've flown over many times. It's partway down the Baja Peninsula on the Pacific side of Baja, California. A band of pilots, doctors, dentists, hygienists, and nurses have stuffed themselves and equipment and supplies into a Piper Saratoga, Cherokee, a couple of Cessnas, and even a Grumman Tiger. They're flying from their suburban homes in Southern California, crossing the border into Mexico, and traveling to extract teeth, check blood pressure, provide solace, and teach children how to maintain their toothy grins. Mission Flight was started by pilot Mike Gableman just 3 years ago, along with friend and fellow pilot Mauricio Gonzalez. The two friends are members of a church community in El Monte, California. Quote, I went to San Quintin to volunteer at an eye clinic, which is offered twice a year through another organization, said Gableman. On that trip, I met Pastor Joel, who used to be a field worker in the area. He had a vision for his small church to be used as a dental clinic for the surrounding community, which is comprised mostly of farm workers. Dental care is vastly needed. In response to what Gableman called the staggering needs in the area, coupled with the invitation from Pastor Joel, Mission Flight was formed to build a modern dental clinic in 2017. The group offers dental care 6 times a year, working with local volunteers from San Quintin. Now, it's a pretty long article. I encourage you to read it. We'll include a link to it here in our show notes. And you can also check out the Mission Flight website at www.missionflight.org. Now, this brings back a lot of memories for me because I first read about an organization like this when I was in high school back in Pennsylvania. And many years later, after I moved to California, I came across Los Médicos Voladores, which translates to flying doctors, which also flew volunteer docs and dentists on trips to Mexico to provide services in underserved areas. And I eventually became president of LMV and flew more than a dozen trips to Mexico in the Cessna T210 that I bought with a partner because it had the highest useful load of any single-engine piston aircraft that we could find. So there are lots of ways we as pilots can help others, and my congratulations to Mission Flight for their great work in Baja California. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, my weekly updates. And then we'll get to our main topic, which is getting pilots to slow down to reduce risk and improve their performance. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Well, first, I'd like to highlight a couple of articles I read this week that I liked and I thought you might like as well. And of course, I'll have links to these in the show notes where you can see the full article. I'll just give a brief synopsis here. This one comes from thepointsguy.com, and it's the How and Why Lufthansa Trains Its Pilots in Phoenix, Arizona. Might be of interest to anyone interested in becoming an airline pilot, including CFIs interested in building the time they need to get to the airlines as they are hiring CFIs and paying hiring bonuses. The article says that the Lufthansa program begins in Germany, where pilots apply to join, and they apparently take only 1 in 10 applicants. Only about 10% of people get in. Before acceptance, they'll go through a battery of tests and interviews, both individual and in a group setting. The individual skills test gauges English ability, math and logical thinking, multitasking ability, and even motor skills. The group testing phase considers behavior, teamwork, and personality. And then at Goodyear Airport in Arizona, Lufthansa is flying about 25 Cirrus SR20 G6s and 18 Beechcraft Bonanza F-33A aircraft. And the article says how much time they spend in Arizona depends upon whether they are on track for either an air transport pilot license, the ATP, or the multi-crew pilot license. They say the ATP track is more akin to a U.S. program with single-engine pilot training followed by 2 months of multi-engine pilot training in Germany. And by contrast, the multi-crew pilot license, the MPL, is an accelerated track that is more like a direct link into the cockpit akin to vocational training. The MPL leads to Lufthansa's mainline and regional operations as well as to Austrian Airlines. The training is identical, except the trainees will spend less time in Arizona flying single-engine aircraft. They'll move back to Bremen after 4 months and learn to fly a Citation CJ1 Plus jet and how to operate with 2 crew members. So you'll find a link to that in the show notes. And here was another great article from airfaxjournal.com, and it was titled, A Year of Stewardship Managing a Flying Club Airplane. And this is written by Sean. He says, after getting my ticket punched in November 2017, I decided to join a flying club to continue to exercise my right and privilege to fly a GA aircraft. Being part of a club would be a better option than renting, as the state of the aircraft would be better than at his previous flight school. He says he wondered how he can contribute to the club, and that a few months after he joined, the club purchased a Cessna 172N model, and they needed an assistant plane captain. Now, I hadn't heard of a plane captain before, so this was kind of a fun read for me. He says, I thought, perfect, this shouldn't be too much work. Yeah, right. And so it sounds to me like an plane captain at a flying club must be the person responsible for making sure everything that needs to be done for a particular airplane gets done And it sounds like an even bigger job for a used aircraft being brought into the club. In the article, he describes writing a letter to club members to let them know about the new acquisition of the airplane, spending a couple of weeks organizing the aircraft documents and getting them scanned online so that club members had access to them, getting the aircraft ADS-B out compliant, and getting the aircraft painted and managing all the other squawks as well. Now, I like this. He summed up the experience at the end by saying, if you want the experience of owning your own airplane without actually having to own your own plane, I highly recommend joining a flying club and helping the plane captains or maintenance officers with their duties. The experience gives you a first-hand view of the types of issues that come up when owning and operating a plane, and given you're on the hook for providing a safe and well-maintained plane, you have none of the procrastination that might come from owning your own airplane. Besides, the sense of service provides you with gratitude and certainly replaces any sense of entitlement that you might otherwise have as just a dues-paying member. So again, great article. I'll have a link to that in the show notes. You might find that fun to read. And then from Forbes magazine, it says, after his search and rescue instructor died on a mountain, Caleb Carr, age 25, co-founded a company to help stabilize helicopter baskets. It says at 15, Caleb was training as a volunteer search and rescuer on Larch Mountain in northern Oregon when his instructor collapsed of an apparent heart attack. A Black Hawk helicopter arrived to transport the stricken men to the hospital, but strong winds swung the rescue basket too wildly to get through the dense tree cover to do an airlift. The instructor died on the mountain. While still in college, Carr spent hours outside of class exploring ways to make helicopter lift systems, used for everything from emergency rescues to delivering supplies, more stable. Eventually, he and co-founder Derek Sikora found a fix in high-powered fans and motion sensors that attach to the bottom of any helicopter hoist to give pilots greater control and counteract violent motions caused by weather or human error. Today, their Broomfield, Colorado company, Vita Inclinata, they say the name is Latin for life by motion, has raised $10.7 million from investors, including Japanese trading giants Kanematsu, and saying it's finalized $150 million in contracts with a few global military suppliers. Vita Inclinata's success gained Carr and Sikora, who are both 25, a spot on this year's Forbes 30 Under 30 list in the manufacturing and industry category. I love what we do, said Carr, the company's CEO. In search and rescue, I learned real quickly that you can be dead tomorrow, so what are you doing today? And there's, of course, much, much more to this article. Fascinating, talking about the technology that they have invented to make rescue baskets more stable underneath the helicopter. And I had an email about the Greenland Air Trophy. Not sure how this came to me, but it was kind of interesting. They say that in June 2020, there will come an aviation competition like never before. Well, actually, it was kind of like one they had before last year, but I digress. The email said that teams coming from the USA and Canada will compete against the Europeans, currently from Germany, Norway, Greenland, Belgium, and the UK. Look out for more about them and what's involved, and they have a link to that, and I'll provide that in the show notes. They say there will be lots of news about our sponsors, including waiving of fees and even discounted fuel, plus lots of free goodies. There are still places available for next year, so please get in touch. If you're interested in being part of the adventure, it's not for everyone. Indeed, passing a telephone interview is a prerequisite, but if you fit the bill and want to do it, give us a call. Now, they had a video that I watched, which was really great. It's 45 minutes long. I watched the entire thing, and it shows this team last year taking off from Scotland. They then stopped on the Faroe Islands. They made 3 stops later in Iceland and then 4 stops in Greenland. And I got to tell you, the scenery was spectacular. So part of their plan for next year is to do a STOL competition and precision landing competition. And they tried out a mini version of that. And in Greenland, they said they had an audience of perhaps 300 to 400 people, which they said was about 5 times the local population. So they actually closed the airport afterwards and opened the apron to all the local Greenlanders who could come out and sit in the airplanes and show their kids what planes look like. And they said that a lot of Greenlanders had traveled a significant distance to view the airplanes. And it was kind of fun watching them fuel the airplanes from fuel drums. And after they were at Greenland, they continued on to do 3 stops in northern Canada in locations that I had never heard of. So these were pretty small towns up in the northeast. So a lot of pilots dream about crossing the Atlantic, and they had an interesting comment here on the video. They said, most do it as fast as possible, but we like to do it slowly and experience it. So I thought that was a great sentiment, so you might enjoy the video. Now, in the video, of the planes I could identify by looking at it included a Cessna 172, a 206, Piper Saratoga, also 1 or 2 SR-22s, and also a Robinson R-44 helicopter. And not only did they cross the Atlantic, but they went from Europe across to Iceland, Greenland, and Canada, and then back to Europe, all in 14 days. So it sounds like a fun adventure. And again, there'll be links in the show notes. And speaking of fun flying destinations that are a little closer to home, we had 2 listeners send us recordings about the same location. And this is a place that I have been to, and here are their stories.
Hey Max, Michael Rogers, a Cirrus SR20T owner in Southern California. My favorite airport is Columbia, Oscar 22. It's nestled in the foothills of the Sierra Nevadas. It's my family's favorite fly camp destination. It has a 4,700-foot runway and a 2,000-foot grass runway. You land on the main runway, taxi on the grass to the end where the campground is. The campground's really cool. It has a toilet, shower facility with running water, electrical outlets, and it's only accessible from the runway. So you only see other pilots there and meet up over the campfire at night and swap some good pilot stories. The town's a short walk away, and it's great fun for adults and kids alike. It's actually a living gold rush town with shopkeepers dressed in 1850s attire. There's coal smoke in the air from the blacksmith shop and stagecoaches rumbling around. There's a fabulous Father's Day fly-in every year. I took a ride in a Stearman one year. It was really a good time. Thanks, Max. Love the show.
Hi, Max. This is Paras Trivedi. I love your podcast, and I've met you a couple of times at local events. I'd like to share with you and your listeners about a great little airport in the foothills of Sierras in California, the Columbia Airport, Oscar 22. I'm sure you know and love it too. At 2,100-foot elevation, surrounded by hills, it's a decent challenge to fly into it. While you are on right downwind to runway 17, you may momentarily lose sight of the runway, then turn base straight towards a hilltop, only to avoid it last minute as you turn final and land on a 4,600-foot runway. From the airport, you can take a short walk, 1 mile long, into town that's basically an old California gold rush town, complete with museums, old-style saloons for dining, and even gold panning activity for kids. There is a grass strip and a campground on the field also, and I hope your listeners fly in safely and enjoy this little treasure of California history and topography.
Well, I absolutely love getting these recordings, and my thanks to Michael Rogers and Paras Trivedi, both of whom, by the way, are Patreon supporters, for passing along these recordings. Now, by the way, I'm completely out of our fun flying destination recording, so if you have a favorite destination that you'd like to tell thousands of pilots about, just use your smartphone and go to aviationnewstalk.com, click on listener questions at the top of the page, and it will walk you through the steps to record either a fun flying destination or a listener question using your phone. Or just use the voice memos or other voice recording app on your phone and email it to me at aviationnewstalk@gmail.com. Now, I want to tell you about my next trip across the country, which will be a week from now, and how you can follow the trip and communicate with me while I'm in the air. But first, I want to announce that there's a new way you can get full access to all my online courses, which normally you would sign up for at pilotlearning.com. And the way you can do that is through a new tier I've created for people who donate to the show through PayPal or Patreon. At this new $35 a month level, you can take my G1000 VFR and G1000 IFR courses and the WAS for Flying GPS Approach courses as many times as you'd like for as long as you're a Patreon member at the $35 a month support level. And when I add new courses to the site, you'll get access to those courses as well. And of course, you'll get the show notes and early access to some of the new episodes, which are benefits at some of the lower Patreon donation levels. Now, let me tell you about the next trip. On Sunday, December 15th, I'll be flying commercially to Knoxville, and the first leg of that trip will be the same as my trip to Florida. That's American Airlines 172 to Dallas-Fort Worth. Now, that's Flight 172, not an actual Cessna 172. And then late on Monday or possibly early Tuesday, I'll start my flight back to California with the owner of a brand new SR22T. Now, this one is equipped with FIKI for flight into known icing conditions, so we'll be able to fly in conditions that we couldn't fly in the one I brought back to California 2 weeks ago, which wasn't turbocharged to get us over the weather and lacked Fiki. Now, I don't have the tail number of this aircraft, otherwise I tell you how to track our flight on flightaware.com, but when I find out, I'll post it on my Facebook page so that anyone who follows me on Facebook can track our flight, and you can find a link to my Facebook page in the show notes. And once again, Patreon supporters can chat with me via satellite text messages, just as we did on my trip 2 weeks ago. And like last time, you'll be able to play along with us in real time by analyzing the weather and then decide what you would do in our situation. And then you can share ideas or insights you have about where to stop along the way and what our best routing options may be as the weather changes in real time. And while we're there, you can just send me a text message, which will reach us in the plane via satellite. Now, we are limited to 160 characters, so please be brief and to the point. And if you've been thinking, oh, darn, I've been planning to become a Patreon member, but just haven't gotten around to it, do it now. As soon as you sign up, you'll get instant access to the recent post that tells you where to find the website where you can monitor our progress, courtesy of Garmin and the Garmin InReach that they've lent me for the trip. And from that website, you can send us text messages via satellite for free. And it's easy to support the show via Patreon. Just go to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome and use a credit card to select the amount you'd like to donate each month. Or if you'd prefer to donate via PayPal, simply go to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal and enter either a one-time donation or regular monthly donation via credit card. And now let me thank some of our newest supporters. They include Todd Simondinger, Brian Wade, who edited his pledge up to $20 a month, Josh Kowit, Chris Hewitt, Dr. Warren Brule, Martin Sasso, Jared Garver, and Ed Vaughn is back with us again. We also had some one-time donations through PayPal. My thanks to Andre Danin, $10 for the impressive mock check ride. Glad he enjoyed that episode. Jeff Hare, $10, and Slade Evans, $25. Now, we have some mega supporters who donate $50 a month and more, and I mentioned their name on each show, plus they get one of my books after 2 months, and these mega supporters are Brian Deere, who lives here in Northern California and flies at Turbo 206, Tyson Weiss, co-founder of ForeFlight, Victor Vogel, who lives in Central PA and flies a Cirrus, Tim Delaney, who's been flying for nearly 50 years and flies here in Northern California in a Cirrus, Stephen Elop, he flies a turbocharged 182 and a Citation M2, and he's the CEO of API Jet. Larry Noe from New York, New York. He's just about to get delivery of his Cirrus. And Mike Williams, he's the president of Keomac and TCB Composites, which makes composite spinners and bulkheads for GA aircraft. He flies a 172. Seth Lake, who's a new DPE giving check rides in Arkansas. He also specializes in teaching the multi-engine rating. You can find his site at vsl.aero. And Rick Miller, he teaches in the Cincinnati area, both out of the Lunken Flight Training Center and with owners who fly Pipers, Cessnas, Beechcraft, and Cicadas. He said he'd like to teach full-time, but he still has the day job. I'd like to thank all these Patreon supporters and everyone who has joined us in Patreon over the last couple years. And in a moment, we'll be talking about getting pilots to slow down to reduce risk and improve their performance, right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. When we think of airplanes, we often think of speed. And I think we like to think that airplanes can save us time by getting us to our destination faster. And in some cases, that is true. So speed and airplanes, they're probably inextricably linked together in our minds. But as a pilot, I found that rushing speedily through all the tasks associated with flying an airplane can be counterproductive at best. And in the worst case, it increases risk and leads to accidents. In a few minutes, I'll tell you about an accident that destroyed a $900,000 airplane, in which rushing was clearly one of the factors that led to that accident. But first, I'm going to start by talking about how rushing through the pre-flight can be counterproductive, and then talk about the other phases of flight where rushing is also counterproductive. Now, the reason I decided to talk about this topic today is I recently instructed on a flight in which afterwards I counseled the pilot that his rushing through various tasks had led to a number of errors that were very avoidable. Now, interestingly, I saw this rushed approach manifest itself in multiple ways in the flight, and it made me think about the many ways that rushing as a pilot works against us. And ironically, I think that rushing pilot tasks rarely saves time. More often, it leads to errors that actually further delay a flight. You've certainly heard the old adage that haste makes waste, and that is just totally true when it comes to flying an airplane. So regardless of whatever you're doing right now, just slow down, relax, and take a listen to some of these stories of how speeding through life as a pilot can be totally counterproductive. But first, let me come clean here and confess that I have spent much of my life rushing And I think part of that is my engineering training is I'm always looking for ways to gain a little bit of efficiency in whatever I'm doing. And I've pretty much conducted a lot of my life on the theory that if I speed my way through life, I'll get through my task quickly. And that's going to somehow leave more time to do more tasks, or maybe hopefully more time just to relax and veg out watching TV or whatever I'd like to do in my leisure time. And in my early years as a pilot, I carried this approach over to my flying as well. And yeah, it may have occasionally saved me 1/10 of an hour on the Hobbs meter, which saved me a few dollars, but there was a lot of collateral damage along the way. For example, I can't tell you how many times during pre-flight that I banged my head on the wing strut of a Cessna. And that often took all of the fun out of a planned flight. It's just not fun flying when your head is still hurting after hitting a stationary object. Now, there's an old joke about how you can tell someone is a Cessna pilot, and it totally relates to the problem of rushing around during pre-flight. So how do you know someone is a Cessna pilot? By the diamonds in their forehead. And if you don't get that joke, the next time you're around a Cessna, look at the trailing edge of the ailerons and just imagine banging your head into them. Boy, that would hurt. Now, besides banging my head on the strut, I can think of multiple times when I was standing just outside the cockpit of a Cessna, probably with a checklist in my hand, leaning into the cockpit to do some pre-flight items. And invariably, I would start to dart off to do some other task like checking the lights, and then I would bang my shins on the wheel strut, which fairly effectively traps you when the door is open and you're standing next to the cockpit. But finally, after many years, because I'm a slow learner, I trained myself that when I was standing in that area, all movements of my legs had to be very slow and deliberate. But I'll tell you, it took a number of bruises and nearly falling over multiple times to start to realize that dashing off from that position to do another task was not only counterproductive, but it hurt. And I'm not particularly into pain, which is why I changed my ways. I've also tripped over chains and ropes that are used to tie down the aircraft multiple times. And I remember at least one occasion where I ripped the bottom of my trousers when tripping over a chain. I also remember falling over backwards when I used a tow bar to pull an airplane, and the tow bar suddenly disconnected from the plane. So there are just lots of ways to get hurt during the pre-flight. And slowing down and moving deliberately through the steps is a really good formula for reducing bumps, bruises, and worse when you pre-flight an airplane. And by the way, for years, I continued to rush through most aspects of my life. But eventually, as I started to realize that rushing during flying was counterproductive, I started consciously slowing myself down as soon as I reached the airport. So, for example, during pre-flight, I would move more slowly and deliberately, and guess what? I stopped banging my head, and that made flying a lot more pleasurable. So when you get to the airport, don't be running to get to the airplane, because if you do, you'll be less aware of what's going on around you. For example, you'll be less likely to notice someone sitting in an airplane who's just about to start that plane, and you may be more conscious as you walk past a row of airplanes to make sure that you're not walking close to the props or tripping over ropes and chains. And just a couple of weeks ago, I noticed a problem where a pilot had rushed to pre-flight. We'd just climbed into the airplane, and the pilot was ready to start the aircraft when I pointed to the top of the cowling and I said, "What's that?" Because I really didn't know. And the pilot looked out and said, "Oh, those are my car keys. I put them down there when I was checking the oil. I guess I should have put them in the cockpit instead." And recently I read a story that Flying Magazine posted online in October at flyingmag.com called "Slow Down Your Flying When Haste Leads to the Loss of a Fuel Cap." I'll include a link to it in the show notes, but essentially the author described landing at 9:45 p.m. at night to get fuel and the long series of delays that occurred in the process of trying to get fuel. Because of the problems with the fuel truck, the pilot decided that having just 5 gallons in the left tank and adding 26 gallons to the right tank would be sufficient. When the pilot reached his destination, the passenger looked out at the right wing and said, "Why don't we have a fuel cap?" The pilot looked in the tank with a flashlight and couldn't see any fuel in the right tank. By the way, remember, he had just 5 gallons in the left tank. So the pilot believes that the low pressure over the wings sucked the fuel out of the tank during their flight. He concluded by saying that with all the problems they had fueling that night, quote, "the fueler probably didn't put the cap back on." Think about that. Or at least didn't put the cap locking lever down, and I failed to do a proper pre-flight. I'm sure the fact that it was raining was also a factor. Yeah, it probably was. But people, think about this. Why would you ever rely on the fueler to assure that your fuel caps are on properly? I mean, take your responsibility as a pilot in command seriously. Don't rush always, always, always take the time to verify yourself that the fuel caps are on securely. But slowing down pre-flight is just the beginning. As pilots get more experienced and more proud of their skills, I think there's a tendency to rush through checklists. At least that's what I'm seeing with pilots as they get more experience. And when they start going through checklists faster, they're more likely to miss an item on the checklist. And that's what I noticed with a pilot I flew with a few days ago. A couple of items got missed during the before takeoff checklist, and since I was monitoring closely, I was able to point out the steps that had been missed, and he went back and did those. And I think pilots also accidentally skip steps while doing checklists simply because they don't have a good system for using their checklist. For example, they may do an item on the checklist, lose their place in the checklist while doing an item, and then resume the checklist at the point that skips over one or two items. When I use a checklist, I like to keep my left thumb just under the item I'm performing, and then after I've completed that item, I'll move my thumb down one item and do the next item on the checklist. With electronic checklists, it's a little easier to maintain your place as you're pushing a button or tapping a screen to check off each item as you complete it. And by the way, if you ever lose your place on a checklist, make sure you go back a couple of items for where you think you are in the checklist. Otherwise, you may inadvertently skip one or more items on the checklist. Now, radio work is another big area where pilots rush, and when they do, they often make mistakes. On the flight I flew a couple days ago, when the pilot called ground to let them know that he had completed his run-up and was ready to taxi to the runway, he jumped into the middle of a conversation that wasn't complete. The pilot behind us, who was a student pilot, had just called that he was ready. Ground responded with taxi instructions, and before the pilot could read back those instructions, the pilot with me started talking. That led to a number of repeated transmissions and delays, which ended up confusing the student pilot behind us, and ground eventually told us to go ahead and taxi ahead of him because he had stopped responding to the instructions he was getting from ground. So when you go to make a transmission, don't rush to push the microphone and start talking. Here are some common mistakes I see people make when they're talking on the radio because they rush to start talking. I've just given an example where a pilot jumped in the middle of a conversation that wasn't complete, and always listen before you transmit and listen for the conversation to conclude. So if a controller has given an instruction, wait until after a pilot has finished reading back those instructions. And if you're unable to hear the pilot read back a controller instructions because perhaps he's too far away from you, wait for about the amount of time you think that it will take him to read back the instructions before you start calling the controller. And when changing frequencies, don't immediately start talking. I once watched a pilot switch frequencies and immediately start talking. I asked him afterwards how long he'd waited before talking, and to his credit, he said, rather contritely, a millisecond? No, it was an honest answer that described what he had done. And the point is, you always need to listen before transmitting, even when changing frequencies. And another common radio problem I see is when pilots start talking before they've thought about what it is they're going to say. Often the pilot is requesting flight following, but they haven't taken the time to think about where they are right now when they report their position. And so they just quickly make up a position, which is invariably wrong. So anytime you're about to talk on the radio, stop to think for a moment about what you're going to say. And if you need to report your position, figure out ahead of time where you are so you don't just make something up and give a position that's miles away from where you really are. An easy way to do this is to push the nearest button on a GPS navigator, which will give you the distance and direction to the nearest airport. But first, you'll need to reverse the direction before reporting it as your position. So if the GPS says the nearest airport is XYZ Airport and it's 7 miles away on a course of 235 degrees, well, just think through that 235 degrees is southwest on a compass, and the opposite of southwest is northeast. So you should report your position as 7 miles northeast of the XYZ Airport. And if you just slow down and figure this out before you start transmitting, you'll give a far more accurate position report. And I just read an NTSB report about the collision of a Piper Warrior and a Diamond DA-40 on the runway at Sebring, Florida Airport last year. The student pilot announced the Diamond's position on every leg of the airport traffic pattern, but neither pilot heard the pilot of the Piper make any transmissions. After the accident, an examination of the Diamond revealed the transceiver was set for 122.7, which is the public CTAF frequency, the Common Traffic Advisory frequency. However, the transceiver of the Piper was set for 122.725, so basically one click off. And I see pilots set the wrong frequency often. So slow down and take the time to be more deliberate when you set frequencies and set them correctly. Once you're in cruise, pilots commonly want to get to their destination as quickly as possible. So they'll set the throttle for 75% or whatever the maximum continuous power is for their aircraft. Then they'll go through the procedure for leaning their aircraft to reach a peak. And yes, this is usually the fastest way to get to your destination if your final destination is less than a gas tank away. But if you're going on a very long trip, like my trip from Miami to California that I talked about last week in episode 131, going at full power and reach a peak may not be the fastest way to get to a destination that's far away. Instead, if you fly slower, which lets you fly farther on a single tank of gas, you can often eliminate a fuel stop, which can save you time. I estimate that a fuel stop typically costs me about an hour. And if you think, oh, I can do it in less time than that, you're probably thinking about just the time the airplane is on the ground, and that certainly is less than an hour. But to fully assess the cost of a fuel stop, you first need to consider the time you lose while descending and then flying the traffic pattern to land. And to that, you also have to add the time it takes you to take off and climb back to the altitude you were flying at. Though if you're flying at a low altitude, say 3,000 feet or less, yeah, it could take you less than an hour, though. On long trips, I'm typically flying at higher altitudes. And if you're truly looking at the full cost of a fuel stop, you'll need to look at the extra fuel you're burning as you climb back up to altitude. For example, the normally aspirated SR20 I was flying last week burns about 27 gallons an hour during the initial climb, and the turbocharged version I'll be flying next week burns somewhere between 37 to 40 gallons per hour during the climb. And that's just extra money you'll have to pay for fuel to climb if you have to make an extra fuel stop. So in general, flying at lower power settings increases your range, and running an engine lean of peak versus rich of peak will reduce the amount of fuel you'll burn, which also increases your range. Now, of course, not all engines are set up to be run lean of peak, and that's a topic for another show. Another great time for pilots to slow down is when they encounter turbulence or when they expect that they will encounter turbulence. Obviously, you and your passengers will be much more comfortable as the bumps won't be quite as severe if you're flying slower when you encounter turbulence. It's also better for the airplane. When you're flying fast in turbulence, you have smaller safety margins, and it's possible that you could exceed the G loading for your aircraft, which in the extreme could cause the airplane to bend or to break up in flight. In fact, your airspeed indicator is marked to help you avoid doing this. Next to the higher speeds, you'll find a yellow arc, and that defines the airspeed for which you must be in smooth air to operate. If you're flying in turbulence, you must slow the aircraft to the slower airspeeds, which have a green arc next to them on the airspeed indicator. And to really be safe, you should get below the maneuvering speed for your aircraft. Maneuvering speed is not marked in the airspeed indicator, but it should be posted somewhere on your instrument panel as a placard. You can also find it in your POH. And here's an important thing to know about maneuvering speed. It changes with the weight of your aircraft. Typically, maneuvering speed is defined for the maximum gross weight of your aircraft. But if you're under gross, as we typically are for most of any given flight, maneuvering speed is an even lower airspeed that may or may not be defined in your POH. So in general, when you hit turbulence, slow down for the good of you and your passengers and for the structural integrity of your aircraft. Another good time for pilots to think about flying slower is when they're in the traffic pattern. If you're flying a faster aircraft, you want to slow up before you enter the traffic pattern because there may be other slower aircraft in front of you. And if you get too close to them because you didn't slow up, well, then you're more likely to have to go around. So slowing up in the traffic pattern can actually get you on the ground sooner if it keeps you from having to do a go-around. Another good reason not to be fast in the traffic pattern is because at higher speeds, your turn radius will be greater. And if your turn radius is greater, that increases the chances that you'll overshoot on the base to final turn. And there have been numerous accidents, like the one that we talked about in episode 99, that have occurred when a pilot overshot the turn to final and then incorrectly tried to compensate by adding additional rudder. Please don't do that. That is an excellent formula for a stall spin accident and a very quick trip to the hereafter. So it just does not pay to be fast in the traffic pattern. I recently read online the post of a pilot who insisted by flying the traffic pattern 20 knots faster and then waiting until final to add all of his flaps and then slow down, that he was safer because he had a higher margin above the stall speed and hence would be less likely to stall. Now, what he didn't factor into his calculation was that by not having any flaps deployed, his stall speed was going to be significantly higher, thus taking away much of the safety factor he thought he was gaining by flying fast. And so about the only thing this unconventional traffic pattern was going to gain him was a much larger turn radius, which increases the odds that he would overshoot the final. After landing, there are lots of ways that rushing can cause problems. I remember one pilot who accidentally turned down the wrong taxiway, which was a dead end. To save time, the pilot tried to make a U-turn in the taxiway. Instead, the pilot struck a light pole at the end of the taxiway. Now, although it would have taken more time, it would ultimately have been more expedient to just shut down the airplane, attach the tow bar, turn the aircraft around, restart the airplane, and continuing taxiing. By contrast, think how much time was wasted dealing with the insurance company and getting repairs done to that aircraft. I often see two other mistakes that pilots make by rushing through their shutdown checklist. First, it's important that after you pull the mixture to idle that you wait until the propeller stops before turning the magneto key to the off position. If you rush and turn off the mag key before the engine stops turning, you're going to leave some unburned fuel in the cylinders of the engine. And it's important that we wait before turning off the key so that all of the fuel in the engine is burned, because that's one of the safeguards that prevents us from getting a hot prop. Because under some circumstances, if there's fuel left in the engine and you move the prop slightly, the engine can fire for just a couple of seconds, which of course is just enough to kill you or send you to the hospital. So please wait until the engine stops completely before turning off the mag key. The other error I frequently see is people forgetting to turn off the mag key. It's funny, they'll run completely through the entire shutdown checklist, but somehow they forget to turn off the key. And you certainly don't want to be anywhere near the prop if the mag key is still in the both position. So it's important that you remember to turn off the mag key when you shut down the aircraft. A lot of people will then place the key on top of the glare shield so that when they're outside the aircraft attaching the tow bar, they can see the keys on the glare shield and thus verify that they're out of the ignition. Now, I mentioned an accident that occurred from rushing during a before takeoff checklist. In that case, the pilot was distracted and went through the before takeoff checklist extremely quickly in a brand new SR20. And when he did, he skipped over the steps that called for setting the flaps to 50%. And unlike many other aircraft in a Cirrus, all takeoffs are done at 50% flaps. And yes, he could have taken off successfully even with flaps up, though it would have taken a slightly higher rotation speed and a few hundred feet or more of extra runway to do so. When he went to rotate, the aircraft didn't feel right to him, so he aborted the takeoff, went back on the runway, went through the fence at the end of the runway, and destroyed the airplane. So here's a case where being more deliberate about running his checklist slowly and carefully would have avoided an accident. And just a couple weeks ago, I rushed out of the house to get to the airport, and about halfway there, I realized I'd left my wallet at home. Now I keep my pilot certificate and medical in my wallet. So I was now faced with a choice of turning around to go back to the house to get my wallet, which would make me late for a student appointment, or continuing on to the airport and flying illegally without my pilot certificates and medical. Well, I turned around and went home because I always try to follow all of the rules related to flying. But imagine if I had continued on to the airport. And then what if I got ramp checked by the FAA and didn't have my pilot certificates and medical? Now, I agree, the odds of that happening were slim, but imagine how many hours of my time I would have lost if I had to deal with what would have been a clear violation of the FAA's. Now, I assure you, being 15 minutes late for my appointment was a minor inconvenience compared to what I would have had to deal with if I hadn't gone home to get my wallet and later got ramp checked. Well, there you have it. Lots of reasons to slow down when you're flying. And as you can see, often performing tasks as a pilot more slowly helps you avoid mistakes that can lead to accidents. Coming up next, listener feedback right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And here's an email from Patrick in Vermont. He says, "Hi, Max. I was listening to episode 98, and you mentioned a well-written letter to EAA chapter members sharing the podcast. Could I get a copy of that to modify for our chapter newsletter?" Well, of course. He says, "Love everything about the podcast. I started listening as a way to keep up to date on aviation news, but have found so many benefits with each episode topic. Keep up the good work. And if anybody else wants a copy of the newsletter article that someone wrote for their EAA chapter, let me know, pass it along to you, and you can let other folks in your EAA chapter know about the Aviation News Talk podcast. In fact, I've had some people contact me about using portions of our show to play at club meetings. Certainly you can do that as well. Just tell people how to find the podcast. And here's an email from one of our Patreon supporters, Larry Noe in New York. He says, in your last episode, you had a listener talking about favorite flights, and he talked about the New York VFR corridor. You may want to let people know that they should look at the VFR chart for altitudes, reporting points, etc. You need to be below 1,300 feet so you can fly by the New York skyline without a clearance. And yeah, that's a beautiful flight. And here's an email from another Patreon supporter. This is Troy Wistman. He says, your guest, Jason Blair, said that owners often get caught off guard on the seat rail AD, that's AD 2011-09, when the 100-hour inspection may come due before the annual. By the way, this was for Cessna 172s. He says that AMOC L115W-11-986, dated December 5th, 2011, which most owners utilize, extends the inspection interval to 220 hours. Of course, the annual entry should note that AD 2011-09 was complied with using the AMOC by number and note when the next inspection is due by date and hours. And he included a sample entry. He says, can you share this with your guest and maybe a comment on a future episode for your listeners that are Cessna owners? And yes, I did forward this on to Jason. And I think this applies not just to 172s, but probably to 182s and a number of other Cessnas as well. Troy, by the way, owns a turbocharged retractable 182. Thanks for sending that along. And here's an email from Chris Weixerek. He says, I love Jason's comment about making sure you have PIC cross-country time tabulated correctly. I found using an electronic logbook is a great way to reduce the gotchas of time logging for qualifications and currency. The computer will always do as good a job or better than us if we enter in the data correctly. For my instrument rating, I simply push the 8910 form button and got my PIC XC qualification time generated for me, exactly 50.4 hours. He says, I love the free website, myflightbook.com. And he says that's not tied down to any app that you might have to pay for. And here's a message I got via Facebook from Paul Milner. He says, Max, pleasure meeting you at AOPA in Livermore. I've been listening to your podcast since I discovered it there from your talk. Just now listening to episode 128 and had a couple of things to add to your reasons for selecting right or left tank at a Cessna or other high wing. It's not uncommon for lateral forces during taxi with full tanks to push some fuel into the vent system on the left or right, depending upon which turns were the most vigorous. When that happens, the vent line that's blocked by fuel will inhibit fuel flow from that tank, creating an uneven tank scenario. He says one can clear the vent line by 10 seconds of cross-controlled flight, or much less disconcerting to passengers would be selecting the fuller tank and allowing fuel flow from that tank to suck the vent line clear. Also, some aircraft like the fixed-gear Cardinal have asymmetrical fuel header tanks. In the Cardinal FG case, the right header tank has a vent connection. If parking on a sloped ramp, the aircraft is placarded select right tank. Otherwise, fuel can transport via the vent system from the right tank to the left tank should it be selected, allowing expensive fuel to dump on the ground via the vent system. Bad thing. And Paul signs this Cardinal Flyers Online, which of course would be a type club for owners of Cardinals. And yes, in a lot of Cessnas, we as a final checklist item will select either the left or the right fuel tank, because when you go to fuel those aircraft, if you leave it in the both position, fuel that you're putting into one tank will then travel over to the right tank, and you may not get a full load of fuel unless you park it in the left or right position. Now let's go to listener questions. This was a Facebook message from Mo in North Carolina. He says, hello, Mr. Trescott. I obtained my CFI rating in April. My question to you relates to instructors having a niche. If I want to specialize in instrument instruction, am I robbing myself of experience by obtaining the CFII and focusing only on instrument instruction and never doing primary instruction? And I wrote back to Mo. I said, nice to meet you. I am a strong believer in specialization. That's certainly what I've done for almost all of my CFI career, and I think it pays dividends both to the CFI and to the client to specialize. Sure, there's a case to be made for broadening our experience and being able to teach lots of things, but given the choice, I think it's better to be an expert in a few things than to be an average flight instructor in many things, and have fun teaching. Thanks so much for your message, Mo. And here's an email from Dusty in Montana. He says, hi, Max. I just received my private a few weeks ago and would like to move on to instrument, then commercial. With money being tight, I would like to get some scholarships that my state puts out. Do you have any tips on how to go about winning these scholarships? Thanks, Max. Love the podcast. Keep up the good work. Well, I said to Dusty, nice to hear from you again. First, don't limit yourself to just scholarships in your state that you know about. I'd research and apply for every scholarship that you can find that you qualify for. I once bought a book listing hundreds of scholarships so that I could lend it to someone. And now there's an even better solution, a $10 ebook by Carl Valeri, who we've had here on this show. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes, but it's available through Amazon. I also mentioned to Dusty that I was on the scholarship committee for many years for the Aero Club of Northern California, and I've probably read 100 or more scholarship applications. Step one is to very carefully read and note everything that you have to send in for a particular scholarship. When I went through the applications, I usually tossed about 20% of them out automatically simply because the person applying didn't take the time to understand what it was they were supposed to submit. Now, if they're that careless sending in an incomplete application, I always had to wonder, how careless are they going to be as a pilot in the airplane? And as you answer the questions that are required, try to work in information that shows your long-time involvement with aviation, your personal career goals in aviation, and how the scholarship fits in with that overall picture. If you have a financial need and might not otherwise be able to complete the training you desire, then explain that too. Also explain any challenges that you've had financially and, most importantly, what you've done to try to overcome those challenges. Everyone faces challenges, but I think a scholarship application reviewer is more likely to favor an applicant who can show that they've met and overcome some of these challenges in the past. Especially, you want to show that giving a scholarship to you is a good investment in the future of aviation. By helping to fund your training, they are giving a little extra help to someone who already has a track record for being committed to aviation and for overcoming obstacles. And these are the kind of people we all want to help, as it feels like they may be the ones who will most likely benefit from some financial help now and have the highest odds of having a successful long career in aviation in the future. And Dusty, I would also list everything you've done that's aviation related, whether it's been washing airplanes, giving rides to young eagles, attending free FAA wing seminars, or whatever it might be. Just try to show that you have an above average commitment to aviation. I hope that helps. And I want to thank the several listeners who called or emailed this week who wanted to talk about buying a Cirrus. If you're interested in buying any model of Cirrus, especially if you're thinking about new or used and can't quite make that decision, please contact me first. Give me a call, 650-967-2500, or go to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the website. And of course, you can also use the website to leave any listener questions or to give us any feedback for the show. I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people literally around the world. And finally, please take a moment to show your aviation friends how they can get the Aviation News Talk podcast. And if they don't know what a podcast is, send them out to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store, where they can download our dedicated News Talk podcast app, just like they would for any other app for iOS or Android. In the App Store, just search for Aviation News Talk. And yeah, it's a free app. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.